This finding comes from the Latino podcast listener report. This is the second year we have done this study, and the increase in podcast consumption among U.S. Latinos in 1 year is incredible. As of this year, the majority of U.S. Latinos, 56%, have listened to a podcast. This is a significant finding in itself since last year. That number was less than half. So, U.S. Latinos have crossed the threshold of 50% having ever listened. But even more exciting is the finding that 36% of U.S. Latinos aged 18 plus are now monthly podcast listeners. That's 16 million people, and it's a massive 44% increase over last year. To give you some perspective, the overall growth among all monthly podcast listeners in the U.S. went from 37% being monthly podcast listeners to 40%, which is an 8% increase. When you compare an 8% increase among all U.S. listeners to a 44% increase among U.S. Latinos, you can understand why this finding is so exciting. 29% of U.S. Latino monthly podcast listeners also listen weekly, so they are regular consumers of podcasts. And I have to point out that this dramatic increase comes from households regardless of language dominance. 37% of non-Spanish language dominant listeners listen to podcasts monthly, and 36% of Spanish language dominant listeners listen to podcasts monthly. We feel that part of the reason of this increase could be the availability of content that is appealing to Latino listeners, both in English and in Spanish, but also the fact that mainstream podcast platforms are just promoting Spanish language podcasts. Show diversity is very important to promote. Now we watch as hopefully the advertising community continues to respond to these podcast listeners.